This is a story that centers on a place called the Shorebreeze Motel. That motel no longer exists, and my mother is no longer around. My name is Bob Meddings. This is essentially a story about losing your sense of place. My life changed significantly in 1949 when my parents decided to move out of their rented home that was shared with my Uncle Jim and Aunt Floss and moved to the then semi-suburban neighborhood of South Etobicoke called Humber Bay. Humber Bay is often associated with the sometimes notorious motel strip. We began our life there, living in the basement of my Aunt Pearl's and Uncle Gord's motel called the Shorebreeze. The Shorebreeze Motel was one of the family motel businesses in the area, and it originally started as a brickworks. Even though we moved into our new home in 1950, I didn't completely understand my mother's relationship with the Shorebreeze Motel and her sister Pearl, and the strong bond they had. I realized only recently that my mother's mother was absent from her life before her teens, and that was due to mental illness. As a result, the sisters became heads of the household, and the Shorebreeze became their anchor. The motel was where my parents celebrated their marriage, and after a time when my aunt and uncle developed a passion for spending winters in Florida, it turns out that the motel became our second home for 3 months every winter. My mother went from being a maid to becoming a manager and doing the accounts for the motel, and eventually this turned into a full-time job. My mother took great pride in creating a profit in the winter and felt as though she ran it better. The major physical presences in this neighborhood were the Ontario Food Terminal and the massive Christie Biscuits complex. Directly across the street from our home was the Noxema Chemical Company, and this presence was a significant factor in changes in our lives. The Noxema Chemical Company bought up all the properties on Sydenham Street, which included our house. This sale allowed my parents to buy a brand new home in the suburbs of Mississauga and a brand new car for my mom. This was a big game changer for my mother, giving her a whole new life of freedom. With her new car, my mother still continued to commute to the motel, and this lasted for a few years until my father's health deteriorated, and then he became her full-time occupation. Life moved on, and my relationship with the motel strip became minimal. I'd heard rumors and speculation about drugs and prostitution in the area, and had sensed earlier on that it was an area for possible speculation. My aunt and uncle retired from running the motel and moved to their cottage. My aunt's oldest son, Ronnie, now ran the motel, and my mother no longer had a connection with it. And after my father's death in 1991, my mother continued to live alone in her house in Clarkson. In 1994, I told my mother that I was going to see a close relative who was dying in the hospital. I was living in High Park at the time and thought it might be too complicated for her to negotiate a drive to my house. So I suggested that we meet at some place that I thought would be familiar to both of us. It was the Shorebreeze Motel.
In asking my mother to meet me at the motel, I had overlooked the fact that the Parkland Road exit from the QEW did not exist during her time there.
I went to the motel and I waited for my mother. And I waited and I waited, and my mother never appeared. After going home, I got a phone call late at night, and it was my mother. She was calling from a service center on Highway 427. And I could hear a voice in the background giving her directions, and I assumed that everything would be okay. That was a mistake. I called later to her home. There was no answer. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, I went to her home, and she wasn't there. While I was talking to a friend on the phone at 9 o'clock in the morning, the call was interrupted by a police operator to say that my mother had been found walking up an on-ramp off the QEW at Bronte. It appeared as though she had probably driven through the night, fell asleep under a bridge, and when she woke up, probably disoriented, she walked up this roadway. When I drove to meet her, she was laughing and felt like nothing serious had gone wrong. After a second similar incident, where my mother turned a local drive into a drive to Mount Forest, I understood the gravity of the situation and had my mother assessed by a doctor. It turns out that my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease with a serious spatial comprehension deficit.
Although my mother said she would only leave her Clarkson home feet first, in other words, dead, when the time came, she moved seamlessly into the brand new long-term care facility at Kensington Gardens.
13 years later, my mother died peacefully, and I wondered, where do I place her ashes? One of the places I thought of that would be significant in her life was somewhere near the Shorebreeze Motel. In the intervening years, all the landfill that was placed along the lakeshore blossomed into something we never had in my childhood, a large public shoreline with natural areas. This was Humber Bay Park. Directly behind where the Shorebreeze Motel would have stood is now a butterfly garden, and that's where my mother's remains lie.
She was social, an excellent 5-pin bowler, a voracious reader, and above all, had a wicked sense of humor. In her last month, she likely didn't know who I was, but she could process a double entendre and sing the lyrics to a hummed melody.